You'll have to excuse me. I have a little bit of a cold. I'm hoping it's not a distraction. It's either allergy or a cold, but I don't really feel it. You can hear it. So there it is. We're going to talk about anger repression. We're going to talk about the inside out path. I might blow my nose. We'll see what happens. We're going to talk about the inside out path and the practices for that for anger repressors. This is so exciting. And I know it doesn't look like I'm excited because I actually am sick, but it is really exciting because now we can embark on, hopefully I'll make sense of why I've put some of those practices out there. So inquiries to encourage you to do once you hear this context and putting the context together with these inquiries. So if you'll remember, I did a video. I've been asking, I'm doing less videos, first of all, for the purpose of putting out there this path and letting people stay with me. I used to do videos sometimes every day because the work was being developed, but now it's mostly developed with the inside out path. It's right here in my consciousness. It's just a matter of expressing it and getting it out here. We don't have anything in writing like we do with the map. If that becomes necessary, we'll do that. But just hear me out here. We're going to talk about practice and context. And you probably can't hear my dog chomping on food in the background, but if you can, please excuse me, my low budget here. God, I love my dogs. The sound of them eating, I love it. You know what I mean by that? Dog lovers. Okay. See, I gave you in the last few videos that I've done, I just did a video a couple months ago. Really, the videos that I want you to pay attention to begin with a video called a KI map, an introduction and overview. If I were you, if anything that I say resonates, go there and then watch every video after that. There aren't that many because I've been laying out the path kind of one video at a time, taking certain topics more methodically than I usually do. So for example, you'll see sabotage as an early topic. Recently, I did the inside out path, laying it out generally. Sabotage has to be dealt with early, I meant on the path because it comes up. Obviously, it's sabotage. It comes up early. And I did a video on what do you really want? Because that's a question that's relevant on the inside out path because we're dealing with authenticity, being ourselves, fully ourselves for healing, but also just for awakening. That's part of awakening. Now she's drinking water. So the context I've laid out in that video, I've talked about sabotage. I've talked about what do you really want to set the tone for the path. And I've done some videos where I've given some inquiries for everybody, actually. And you're going to see those inquiries given to you in the videos that have been released since that video, a KI map. So if you start with a KI map, an introduction, an overview, and you watch each video, there aren't that many, you're going to see the inquiries that I've given you, which are for anger repressors would be, I can say and do what I want. As a reverse inquiry, carry that around with you. Witness mind and body. Write some of this down. If just little points, like if I say, I can say and do what I want when you have somebody in your awareness or something, feel the energy that objects, and then listen and allow for each of the words and pictures because there's a mind-body connection. And you're starting to make conscious the repression of the self, which is behind the identifying with the false self. It's the root of it. So you're starting early with that work, with that inquiry. And as I said in the video, the inquiry, I can say and do what I want, starts to activate the repression mechanism itself, which, remember what that is? That's just a reaction, like your nervous system saying, no, I can't. A lot of energy with it if you're an anger repressor. But there's an activation of the mind-body connection in that, but it might not become conscious in that inquiry because the mechanism is basically really simple. It's childlike intelligence around safety and getting love. Basically, it is with regard to anger, it would be, I can't. No, I can't. I can't. I'm angry, but that's really buried for anger repressors. I'll show you how to access that. But there's also that I can't. So that's the mechanism essentially, and the frozen fear around it. So there's conditioning that says, I'm afraid. I'm afraid. That's real conditioning with real emotions buried with it, layered in the body. So with the inquiry, I can say and do what I want. You're going to see a lot of the effects of that mechanism. So you might, well, you're going to hear and feel the no, I can't, which is actually the somatic mechanism itself. But you'll see that what gets produced a lot of times are not thoughts like I'm angry and I can't get angry with that inquiry. What comes up is I can say and do what I want. No, they won't like me, or something like that, which is like a utility. So I hold anger back to get love. See, I hold anger back to stay safe. And remember that we're never seeing reality. That's evolution. That's evolutionary science. That's quantum physics. That's postmodern philosophy. That is non-dual. We're not experiencing objective reality ever. And the model that I like to bring in for our context is that we're only seeing the programming that we need, like a user interface. That's all that we're seeing. We're not seeing a world. Remember the evolutionary research, I don't know if I've said this, where they actually studied the number of times that we adapt in evolution towards seeing things the way that they are, seeing the world as it is, and the number is 0. We are not programmed for that. We're programmed for safety, basically to survive and procreate, to stay safe, get love. That's why we're holding anger back at the very core unconscious level. Now, you may not have discovered those unconscious programs, but KI will show it to you, because making those programs conscious is what starts to transmute the buried anger. Okay, but for now, the inquiry that I've given you, again, will not bring up most likely, you'll feel the no, I can't. And that's actually hinting at the mechanism that says, I can't express anger. And for anger repressors, it's that mechanism of I can't, which ends up being the repression of yourself. So then that shows up as, no, I can't say and do what I want. I can't say that. I can't do that. And then that mechanism is active there. But as you're witnessing the mind-body connection with that inquiry, I can say and do what I want, and you're allowing everything, you're going to start noticing changes in the body. Contractions will start to shift. Even chronic pain can. And then you're going to want to become more skillful, because remember, this is one of the most important things I can tell you in terms of the practice for anger repressors on the inside out path, which is you have to at some point notice or understand, at least, that you're activating a repression mechanism with that inquiry. You're activating a very deep unconscious no to anger. And so you don't want to just stay on that inquiry. You want to make that conditioning conscious eventually in third dimension KI in the members area. And that's the only place we're doing that, because that's the trauma work. We have to be conscientious about that and really help people with skill on that. But you can get started now and you can go very deep. This is the inquiry that I started with. I can say and do what I want. It led to a complete transformation. I mean, like, it just unraveled me. Whatever was left of me. And what I mean is the rage, the buried rage that was appearing as chronic pain. Okay. So that's why I gave you the inquiry, to get you started on that. And now I want to talk to you about, why would you want to do this path if you're an anger repressor? And what's the context for that inquiry? What are we really doing? I want you to think about what the inside out path is. So one way of describing what I think are some of the problems with the outside in path is, a lot of times the teaching is coming from a teacher who's just very, recently had a shift to presence, what I call the initial recognition, which is more about seeing that you're the perceiving awareness throughout all experience. And there's some shift in perception, and then people begin teaching. Well, I would imagine that I wasn't living then, but I imagine that back in the tradition, the days of the tradition, before we had this modern style of teaching, a person wouldn't really be able to teach necessarily until their teacher deemed them ready for that. We don't have that kind of checks and balances. Because so what happens is like when I started teaching early, the other shoe hadn't dropped. In other words, there was a lot of embodiment that had not happened. So all that I could do was teach or point from the outside in, because I didn't know my own operating system fully in my inner body, because the trauma is hidden in the body. And it's like the last thing that some of us get to on the path. Some of us finally get to embodiment at the end, even though the body keeps the score and is driving all the suffering. And that doesn't make a lot of sense, see? But it's a product, I think, of just teachers having the first initial shift in perception and teaching from that. And then I did this. And then as you see that the other shoe drops, that there's an embodiment process, you might have to adjust how you're teaching or sharing, because you obviously didn't see everything. But most teachers don't want to do that, because it disrupts a teaching that has been working for people. And also, if there's any shame around that, they're not going to share it. So we want to deal with those issues from the beginning. Is the transparency for the teacher, the trainer, the facilitator, the clients, everybody, you, is important to the extent that we can be transparent and honest, at least to ourselves, about what's really going on for us and whether there is unconsciousness there. And that helps us to the transparency in a way that the outside empath can't, because often there isn't any transparency because of the way that the path is structured. It's the Ram Dass thing. I share that. I love Ram Dass, actually. But he was in, the porn theater line, about to go into a porn theater where you masturbate. He said this publicly. And a student walks up. So he realizes right then that he has shame that he didn't know he had. That was unconsciousness. Or when Adya says that shame, or some teachers say that trauma or shame is like the last layer. So it's hard at the end of a teaching to say, oh, well, there's this. And chances are that was driving a lot of that suffering, but there's no room in the teaching to sort of like at that point, and it just doesn't get expressed and taught about what that's all about, the trauma, repression, and shame, usually. So what happened here is that I came out as an outside in teacher, embodied it, and now I'm coming back for inside out, because I can see the insights from the trauma and repression work and how that's creating bypassing for us from the beginning and throughout the outside in path. So the inquiries that I gave you, and by the way, let me give you the other two. You might want to write them down. This is for anger repressors. I can say and do what I want, not as an affirmation, but you say it and you feel and allow all the objections, mind and body. Stay with it each time until it's quiet. Even repeat it a few times, because you're going through layers of old emotion and conditioning that are holding you back in life. This is really important inquiry for us, anger repressors, I think. So the other inquiries that I gave are, I can be vulnerable with them. So you just pull somebody up, reverse inquiry, I can be vulnerable with them. And then if you feel the energy that says no, you take that to vulnerability inquiry. If you're an anger repressor and you turn to the same person, you say, I can get angry at them. Or I'm not angry, both of those. See, I'm not angry elicits the hidden conditioning, I'm angry, which is the anger itself now for us anger repressors. By the time we get to, as adults to spirituality, the anger has frozen along with the fear of expressing anger, layered in the body, frozen. So when we first come to this inquiry, vulnerability inquiry, and we say, I'm not angry, we're not going to feel anger. It's repressed. So what we're going to feel is like a contraction or chronic pain. There may be some anger. But then we stay with the contraction and we witness the thoughts. We allow the thoughts, I am angry, because that begins to thaw out that anger that's frozen in the body. And we also do the inquiry, I can get angry at them, because the mechanism starts to arise then, the real mechanism. No, you can't. And you can see it more directly. And that primes you for the really, really skillful third dimension work. You really have to do that work though first. It's just the way that it works, because you have to establish the mind-body connection first, because this is a repression. So you have to see the thoughts that say you can't show anger by saying, I can get angry. Or see the thoughts that say you are angry by saying, I'm not angry. And it's really good to do that with people that you think that you're not angry at, but you have a trigger with, or somebody you've disconnected from, mom and dad, boss, anybody. When we repress anger, we do it across the board. So the inquiry is a living inquiry, and it just comes alive like crazy when you take it to all those areas. Regulate your nervous system throughout when you're doing these inquiries. Keep doing them until, keep watching until it just peters out and all there's left is kind of just the awareness. And you're more rested. Look for the 2 markers where you feel more regulated, more sense of awareness at the end of the inquiry, and some energy dissolved, some sensation changed, because that's the transmuting of the energy of repression. You want to look for both of those markers. One marker is that you feel more regulated after you do KI. Even though KI brings up big energy, because you're witnessing all the thoughts around that big energy, it ends up regulating you because you're bringing the repression into awareness, making it conscious. Look for the 2 markers that you feel more regulated and that energy is dissolving. You can see it in awareness. If either one of those 2 markers are not happening, stop KI. Because what we've learned is without those markers, the system starts to think that KI is traumatizing it. Because you're not regulating yourself. You're not really grounding yourself as present. So the system has to respond to that. And that's your sabotage. So you always want to look for the 2 markers. If you don't see one or both, either one of those markers, stop. Come to the members area, work with somebody, come back to these videos and listen to me talking about the inquiry, how it works. Get into training, do something for yourself, because this is a really good modality, but it's easy to get sort of shut down because we're self-protecting around this particular emotion. And that's the sabotage. We'll shut it down. Our system will shut it down sometimes if we don't look for those 2 markers. Okay, so now kind of another fun part is remembering that, when I first, and when any teacher first recognizes that the awareness is always here, we think we're done, and because the other shoe hasn't dropped. Well, I want to talk about the inside out path as having kind of 2 components. One is the recognition of the perceiving awareness. So that's just the usual non-dual or meditation mindfulness, where when you see that in your direct experience through really taking the time to notice it, is that there's a perceiving awareness with all experience. And it's the same perceiving awareness. So when you see thoughts right now, it's that same perceiving awareness that sees those thoughts, that would see the next thoughts, that would look at the counter, or that would look at the sun. Oh, don't do that. Or a television. The same awareness is perceiving throughout all experience, but experience is constantly changing. Nothing is permanent. Well, it can feel like something is permanent when there's trauma and repression. We'll get to that. But the first part of that is from the beginning. You want to have a practice of recognizing the perceiving awareness throughout all experience. And that's just a really first dimension. Most of it, it's just throughout the day, stopping and letting yourself see that as often as possible. That's the nature of your experience. And that's what I've been teaching for 15 years. Nothing new there. But now you're going to enter these inquiries, both when you're triggered and just like as a regular practice to start working with this. In addition to that, seeing that you're the perceiving awareness. Because the perceiving awareness can't see what's unconscious. And that's the limitation of the first part, is that it's just like a telescope or an instrument that looks out into space and can't see the dark matter, but we know it's there, or something like that. So yes, we recognize the perceiving awareness, but we're talking about unconsciousness here. Shadows, repression, trauma, unconscious. So recognizing the perceiving awareness won't show that to you. But if you'll pick up these inquiries and eventually go into the 3rd dimension with us, you will access that unconsciousness and bring that into awareness for a deeper embodiment. So the second part is the embodiment piece. Or some call it the healing aspect of it. We have different words for it, but those two aspects are important from the beginning. And so everybody's going to be different with that. Some people will need to process more with inquiry in the beginning because the repression and trauma has their system hijacked to where it's hard to recognize the perceiving awareness. So they might lean more on inquiry to stabilize in that recognition and then start looking to notice that the awareness is always there. So some people will have to do KI even to recognize that or start to stabilize in it. And some people will have already come to KI with that, mostly that recognition, but with what I call oscillation. So oscillation is just like a fan. It's Audio calls it, I got it, I lost it. But see, you can't lose it, but you can lose the recognition of it. Like, in other words, when you're really identified with something, and that most normally comes from trauma, you're unconscious. In those moments, it feels like I've lost the recognition. Well, we're going to pay attention to that. But here's what we're going to do with that. When you come into KI, when you're experiencing oscillation, what I'm going to say to you is that you don't want to use resting as awareness or that first part when you're triggered. So when you're triggered, you need to go deeper into inquiry with the trigger, in my view, or shadows, or even like chronic pain. So you want to learn to distinguish when to use an inquiry and when just to rest and see that you're the awareness. And that's an art form because we're dealing with unconsciousness. It's not as obvious as it might seem, because remember that be with what is great for the awareness recognition. It's like, it seems like everything is coming and going to awareness. Now we know that everything doesn't arise to awareness now. A lot of stuff in our body doesn't. In KI, we've learned that. But for the purposes of that investigation, what does arise, you can see that the perceiving awareness is there throughout the arising and falling of all phenomena, and that can stabilize you in that. But the oscillation would be, again, the trauma. So remember, with triggers, for example, our trauma is not arising as a memory or programming, we're just reacting. So that's the part of the I lost it, is when we're in emotional avoidance or some trigger or shadow and the unconsciousness is there. And then, of course, a lot of us just rest or do a little bit of inquiry. But what I've learned through the ages is, with people and myself, is you have to process the repression, because the repression is the emotion that we're really not opening to when we're triggered. And that's why we carry triggers over in time. In time means we're not letting go of it. We're not processing it. So we're still shutting down around some emotion. And for anger repressors, that's anger. So you're going to want to know that the oscillation is coming from the trauma and repression that hasn't been met yet. It's a different way of talking about it than maybe you've heard it, but this again comes from being on the path, being in the mental health field, addiction field, doing my own trauma healing, training people, thousands of people. Well, working with thousands of people, training quite a few, 15 years of this. I'm not trying to get you to understand that I know this. I'm just saying, look, I didn't just come up with this. I didn't just wake up one day and thought, this would be an interesting theory. This is tried and true, day after day, year after year of watching people. Because to be with what is, although it's good for the awareness recognition to see that you are that to which everything comes and goes. Well, not everything. But it's not good for the embodiment part, because remember that perceiving awareness cannot perceive what's unconscious, but the unconscious repression is creating and producing so much suffering. So let's talk about that, because if you don't understand that, you won't know why I'm suggesting the inside out path and why I'm suggesting to do inquiry in certain moments and not just rest and see yourself as the perceiving awareness. Triggers. Like I've already said, I bypass anger by resting as awareness and doing light inquiry, second dimension style, and never getting to the anger behind the triggers. So although the triggers essentially went away, I started storing anger in my spine, which became spinal stenosis, nerve pain. So there's usually like even if you're able to like get away with not processing, there's often like this time bomb for people, like disease or illness, or for teachers, I think it's like a scandal or something. It's like something shocking happens because you're not aware that the way that you're processing is not getting to the unconsciousness. So we want to do that from the beginning. We want to understand that when we're triggered, what the trauma research says is that what's creating the trigger is not arising. What's arising is what I can see, which is usually like my partner said something, or, but it's really about dad, or being unlovable, or I can't really express myself, my feelings here. That's the unconscious conditioning running it. But what we see is like, oh, it's the socks. Don't put the socks on the floor anymore, or whatever. But it's not that. And so that keeps happening, that oscillation, that unconsciousness, because we don't see the programming that's driving that in the moment through resting, and it's too unconscious. So there you take inquiry to that. And what I've said for anger repressors is you want to get to your anger repression as soon as you can, because that's like the source of the trigger, because you can't fully express yourself. You're holding yourself back, and you're identifying with the false self that is safe compared to the anger. And you really want to understand that, because otherwise you'll bypass, like I did. You have every right to. I did. I'm trying to help so that doesn't happen. So what I would say is, when you're triggered, is pull back, get quiet, look at the person, and just say, what deficiency story comes up for me here? Do a little bit of inquiry on reversing the deficiency story. So if it's I'm not good enough, just say the opposite. I'm perfect as I am, and watch and allow. But that's not enough for anger repression, because what's driving that deficiency story, remember, that's a false self from childhood, because we couldn't be ourselves. It's so simple. It's actually common sense. When you reverse trauma, you can see it all. When we couldn't be ourselves. So it's quite natural and so innocent that I can't get angry because they won't love me. So therefore, in my relationships as an adult, I can't get angry because they won't love me. That's simple, but unconscious. So therefore, with that resource offline for us, we feel lacking and deficient. That's the source of the deficiency story, is the repression. With the anger offline, we repress ourself, our creativity, our voice, our emotion, and other emotions. And so that feels like lack. So that sense of lack or deficiency is that story that we've been carrying around since childhood, because we couldn't open to our emotions, right? All of them. So KI is about opening to all of them, because otherwise then spirituality is a continuation of the trauma and repression by just simply avoiding that. So during the trigger, when you feel the unlovable or the deficiency story, the lack feeling, the contraction, turn towards mom and dad or your VIPs, which are important people with regard to how you developed, and say this: if you're an anger repressor, not if you're a sadness repressor, I'm not angry at them. Mom and dad or whoever, feel that same contraction that's behind the deficiency story with your whoever here in your current life. That's your repressed anger. Go into the vulnerability inquiry there. I'm not angry. See it. I can get angry. Stay with each one. Write those down. And then you can also do it with the person that triggered you, where you can't open to the anger in the current thing. It's important to go back to mom and dad, because that's the source of the repression. But it's happening here. So you might even turn to your spouse or whoever and say, I'm not angry. And of course, anger repressors won't feel anger, or they might feel a little bit, some, but we're repressing it, or I did, and I know what that's like. So it's going to feel more like contraction or chronic pain or woundedness, or something that feels safer, but it's dense in the body, or woundedness even. And so, but hiding in that is the repression of anger. So if we don't go to the repression in that, that continues to produce triggers. Remember the snake in the grass video? We are often doing it to ourselves as anger repressors, getting triggered because of the repression. And then when it's triggered, we tend to disconnect because we can't express what we need to express. So we store the anger, right? This is a cycle that continues. So because it's continuing every day in all our relationships, we start meeting that in inquiry each day, so that embodiment becomes important from the beginning. So that real healing becomes important from the beginning, not just awakening to the perceiving awareness. I know I'm speaking fast, but you can watch this video as many times as you want. This is not a meditative video. I'm not pointing to awareness. I'm giving you information, and I'm showing you how to do inquiries. It's up to you for now to do those inquiries, to work with people, training sessions, and then eventually come into the members area and I'll do the work with you more. We will, but we can't come out and do it everywhere, all over. We have a place for that. Okay. We have to be able to follow up with you is the thing. We need to be able to watch how you might be still bypassing or getting yourself into a bit of a pickle because you might be activating the trauma, but not skillful enough to really meet it. That's why we have the members area. Yeah, I don't want to go into that right now, but because I don't want to deprive people of this work. I don't like that. I don't like to put it there, but I have to because of some things that have happened. And because I think that with a modality that is as powerful like this, there has to be some conscientiousness about how we give it out to people who might not be ready for it or who might not have the context for it and can easily shut down around it. So we want to be responsible. Okay, so join us there. But you don't have to. I never joined a members area. I just started doing inquiry. I never was a member of a members area, so you don't have to. But if you don't have that earnestness on your own to really meet your experience, and certainly if you don't have the skill, it's not going to work so well because remember, your nervous system does not want to feel the anger. You have to remember that. Okay. So triggers. See, from the inside out path, when you get triggered, here's the thing. When I would get triggered, I had no idea that the anger repression was both driving it because of the snake in the grass thing. Snake in the grass is that when we repress anger, anger in other people is our shadow. So when our partners or other people get angry, it's an emotional shadow coming up. We might be arguing about the socks, but it's really the anger that's scaring us on an unconscious level. So then we stay triggered because we're not opening to our anger. We're doing it to ourselves because we had to survive, but to heal and to be free, we can't keep doing that to ourselves because we're suffering over it. I mean, you can. It's not a rule that you have to do KI, but I'm inviting you into some deeper seeing here, like a much richer seeing than maybe what you've experienced before. Okay. Triggers. See, therefore, when they happen to me, I didn't know that the anger repression was driving it or the snake in the grass was there. So it was like the trigger would happen and I didn't really know what I was doing. So I just rest the perceiving awareness, let it all be. Well, what that does is it provides like, well, that feels peaceful. I feel better, but I didn't get to the root of the suffering that way. So it can be regulating to the nervous system and can even help with transformation to see things like that. But the real root of the trigger or whatever that is in the body. That's the problem there, is that the body is keeping the score and its programming isn't arising. It's just producing these triggers, repression, or contributing greatly to the triggers. It looks like we're triggered because my partner said something about politics, but really, if you're just experiencing emotions, if you could fully feel and express or process your emotions, there wouldn't be a trigger. You'd just be having a conversation. You'd be authentic. They would be authentic. But with repression, we can't be. We shut down because we have our resources offline. See, we're bringing the resource online so that the sense of deficiency and lack is not what meets those triggers, those relationships, because nobody really wants to be met with a deficiency story, right? Like you want to be met authentically and you want to meet people authentically, even if it's scary. The deficiency story can never, ever be authentic. It's self-protecting around an emotion or two or more. Okay. So triggers, see, it's important to know that when you're triggered, then you're not going to be like me. You're going to know what's going on. So you can go straight to the root. I didn't have that. You've got that now. And then when your shadows come up, so this is Ken Wilber's work, this is Carl Jung, there are other researchers that have helped us understand that shadows come from repression. So again, anger repressors. I'm inviting you to do shadow work early and do it often, because this is how it's almost like we just give our anger to others. Hold it for me. I'm not angry. You're angry. I'm not. That's a shadow for anger repressors. We're storing the anger. That's why we're reactive to that. That's why anger is a natural emotion, actually. We have a certain relationship to it It isn't healthy. We're not allowing it. So when you see somebody like that, here are our shadows for anger repression. Anything with big energy, because remember, anger is like one of the bigger energies. So anything that looks like it to the nervous system is potentially threatening. So even if I come off here as a really charismatic or something, or like, oh, I know it all, big energy, and notice that I've done anger repression work. So the energy might be bigger. Here, I'm still a pretty sweet guy, pretty soft, but it's bigger, more opinionated, more like, oh, enthusiastic. Come on, guys. You know what I mean? Like, let's do this. And I used to be like, rest and see. It's repression. See? So, but anyway, I'm not a great example. Think of somebody out there with big energy. Maybe I'm a good example. Somebody said, oh, it's like your creative energy or your attic energy is all over. Okay. But so is that pointing back to you? See, big energy. It could be anger. It could be charisma. It could be know-it-all, authority, narcissist. Now, do we want to be the negative things out there? No, it's not about that. It's like we've just put our anger, we've shadowed it out so that we don't have to feel it. And it's all unconscious. So when we're triggered on something like, she's obnoxious, it doesn't look like it's anger repression. But because it's a mind thing at first, the ego has shadowed it out and it's made it about something else. Like, she's obnoxious, she's opinionated, hiding it from us. But we now know how to inquire skillfully on that and to discover that the reaction is coming from the repression of anger in you, or something else like power or whatever. Repression's behind the shadows. So certain teachers and teachings through the years, like Ken Wilber, thank you, Ken, have encouraged us in the spiritual world to do shadow work from the beginning. I always knew it was important. Now I am completely aligned with him on that. We have to do it early and do it a lot, because this is how we're staying safe. I don't know how many times I can tell you that I've met an anger repressor who's far into the path, who still has issues with authority. And I say to them, look, that is you. That's you. You've repressed and shadowed out your own authority. And so therefore you can't really be authentic because you've given your authority away. And now you're triggered at it, your shadow. You have to fully own that and see that it's coming from that fear and anger, if you're an anger repressor, and re-own that and become the authority in your own life and wake up and embody that. As long as you still have an issue with authority, either you're like positively drawn towards it too much or negatively repulsed by it. If you're an anger repressor, you're storing your anger. That's the separation there, outside yourself, shadowing it out. Creates a strong sense of energetic separation. Realization to me is energetic, mostly. It's energy, awakeness of energy. And so shadow is really asleep, kind of repressed and shut down around an emotion, and then seeing that in others. So you also want to look for the other ones. We don't want the negative traits there, but you have to remember, like when you're seeing a narcissist or whatever, they might not be doing their work. So they're going to have some negative traits, but there's something there within you that you're denying. It's not negative narcissism. It's not like you're really necessarily a narcissist, although we all have a little bit of that in us, and sometimes a lot, because there's ego. But it's not that you're going to, when you do shadow work, you're not going to become a grandiose narcissist. What you're going to do is stop repressing anger. And by the way, classic narcissist clinicians will tell you this. Classically, they repress almost all negative emotions. So when you see them, if there's like a charisma there, you might be attracted to the fact that they're repressing negative emotions and they come off positively, or a certain energy, not from the clarity or the embodiment, but from the repression. And so you might be drawn to it because you've shut your own anger out. There are other reasons that we become drawn to narcissism, but that's one of them. Teachers, partners. It's bigger than that, though. Anything with big energy out there. For that, I suggest both Ken Wilber's 3-2-1 shadow process and our shadow inquiries, which we do in the members area. But you can Google Scott Killaby shadows. There's an article that's free on the internet that goes into great detail about Ken's process. you're not going to want to do shadow work because remember, you don't want to feel anger. So you're going to feel resistance to that. But your resistance, do you want to be free? Do shadow work. That's all I have to say. Do you want to heal? Do it. There's a deeper recognition there. Remember, your ego just wants to stay safe. On the other side of that is a deeper recognition that is actually what you want. It's just scary, and we're going to help you through it. I promise you. If you come to the members area. So shadows and triggers, again, the inside out path, we know, but before they happen, where they come from, inside out. So when you first come, especially in training, we're going to do a series of inquiries where we discover what your primary repression is. Like, for example, anger. We're going to do a little shadow work to just discover what your shadows are and your deficiency story. And that's going to be your template because that's your suffering. And when that stuff pops up, you're going to know exactly how to look at that unconsciousness now, instead of being blindsided by it like I was. And by the way, I was blindsided by chronic pain. That's another thing about the inside out path. If you get a cancer diagnosis, I got a cancer diagnosis and a spinal stenosis diagnosis as an outside in path teacher. It's just shocking. I didn't suffer over it. People were surprised at how at peace I was over the cancer diagnosis, but it's still shocking to the system because with the outside in path, it's like, now I've got to discover what happened after the fact. That's not conscious. So I had to like reverse engineer that. Oh, so I'm holding repression, sexual stuff in my pelvic area, testicular cancer. And then again, I was shocked to discover how when the pain got really bad in my spine, because again, outside empath, you're not armed with the insight about what that might be. But with the inside out path, we're going to know that you already have anger repression. So if you develop chronic pain, we know what that is. Not a mystery. So therefore we can work with that. But not knowing it, it's like just comes out of the blue. Another example that I give so people see this is like the teacher scandals. It's like this just comes out of the blue. You're with a teacher and it's like suddenly now they've abused their power, they've molested somebody, they've cheated on their wife, didn't tell her. And you're like, what? Because you sit there and they point as if the unconsciousness has been seen. Just like I thought with my anger repression. But then the unconsciousness wins. It's like gravity every time. So if there's some unconsciousness, it's going to be acted out. But with the outside empath, it's like shocking. Like, what? I can't believe that he did that or she did that. That's the nature of unconsciousness, though. On the inside out path, if we're training you to be a teacher or something, or you're becoming a teacher, you're going to be aware of your blind spots from the beginning. You're going to know that you have an issue with emotional honesty. So when it comes to like wanting to cheat on your wife or your husband, you're going to do the inquiry around that so that the ramifications of your unconsciousness are seen and met instead of shocking everybody involved. Triggers, shadows, chronic pain, disease. Now we're mapping that stuff out, the drivers to that from the beginning, so that we're not blindsided by it as we are on the outside empath. Another thing I'm going to ask you guys to do is, I've already given you the inquiries for all of this really, is keep going to your teachers. You know, as much criticism as I lob out there, I love Adyashanti. Love that guy. I would sit and have dinner with him today. I love Eckhart. If J. Krishnamurti was alive, I would like hang out with him. I try to. Go to these teachers, whoever they are, if they're good. But be careful, because remember, with anger repression, another way that we get blindsided is that we don't realize there's a trauma bond going on from the beginning. I have to mention this for the anger repressors because we tend to gravitate towards the peaceful teachers. Why? Not because of that clarity, partially, but the other reason is because they become a positive shadow for us. Whether they've dealt with their anger or not is a completely different question. Don't assume that they have. We project too much on people. Don't do that. Do your work. Find out where your projection's coming from. So shadow work. He is peaceful. I'm drawn to that. And with KI, that will lead you back to the anger that you're repressing that makes you do that. You're trying to escape your anger. That's a trauma bond. And so if a teacher is not recognizing your anger repression and is talking about peace, and the teacher either hasn't met their repressed anger or isn't talking about it, then there could be a trauma bond inadvertently created. And it's hard to excavate yourself from a teacher like that because your trauma has attached to it on an unconscious level. This is a lot of the I can't leave the cult, I can't leave the teacher stuff. The roots of that are in the body. This is not just you chose a teacher that was clear. You chose a teacher, many of us, from our trauma. Here, we know it from the beginning. We're going to encourage you. If you're going to say, I want to go sit with Mooji, great, sit with Mooji. Who do you think he is? Who do you think I am? Who do you think that trainer is? Who do you think Adya is? And then we're going to pull it back to you to see where that all is coming from. Otherwise, you're in the dark, like I was. I used to have a crush on Adyashanti. So not only was he peaceful, but he was attractive. So that was my trauma, right? I had a strong projection coming from my anger repression. I didn't deal with it because I was an outside empath. But see, Ajay is a good teacher because he would say, look, if you have any projections towards me, deconstruct those. So he's not really a trauma bonding. He's too awake for it. I mean, if you talk to him about anger, I'm sure he'll go say what needs to be said about that. I just lost my train of thought on that. Yeah, so some of these teachers are actually still repressing anger and some aren't. But the point is the trauma bond it's coming from your side. The teacher acquiesces in it by not addressing that. That's sometimes the teacher's really unconscious and is getting something from that. Remember, if I repress anger, then I put a high premium on peace because I'm self-protecting. So if I can attract people who see me as peaceful, that makes me feel safe. And if they're peaceful and not dealing with too much anger, we're all safe. So there can be some trauma bonding coming from the teacher. Look for those satsangs and retreats in which we're encouraged to just be fucking angry and scared and ashamed and not have to hide that at all. But we can still be conscious in the midst of that, inquire, allow it, fully consciously suffering. But any kind of language and spirituality that downplays these emotions, I think they are problematic for us, those teachings, because our repression is running things. I am responsible for this. I was a teacher with my little small contribution to the world. I was doing this. So I know, I know the ins and outs of this. I was doing it as a student of this work and as a teacher, contributing to a systematic bypass and trauma bonds. Spirituality itself can be a trauma shelter, or a repression shelter is a term that I come up with. It's just like the priesthood can be a shelter for the repression or trauma of being attracted to minors or something. But then it doesn't work because repression always wins. It's like gravity, right? So if it doesn't create chronic pain or disease in the priesthood, they might molest children. The trauma shelter of spirituality, you can't really come to spirituality and actually shelter yourself from the anger. It just looks like it. So what happens is even though we come for the peace and the stillness sometimes as a way to stay away from anger, when they don't know it though, is there's ramifications to that, see? But we wouldn't see it as anger. We might see it as, again, chronic pain, disease, relationship issues, can't speak up, can't say no, have trouble setting a boundary. We want to look at those things in our life. Those are really very relevant to anger repression. If we don't see it, we'll keep doing it, and we're going to miss opportunities for that. I don't know why that came in right there, but it seems important to pay attention. Well, here's where I want to go. First of all, are you an anger repressor? So before we do any of that, right, hopefully many of you have already discovered whether anger is your primary. So you're already off and running with the, I can say and do what I want inquiry. But some of you are just coming to this. And what I would say is just slow down and let's discover your primary repression first. So for those of you listening who can't quite jump into the inside out path because you don't know what your primary is, Let me give you a laundry list of things to look for. One of the tall tale signs of it is not being able to like say no to people or really just disagree. Like earlier today, somebody asked me something, I said no. And that was it. But we have such trouble with that. We have to over explain. We have to like, I feel bad. Like, okay. So look for that. Look for where you find yourself smiling or being peaceful when you actually do not agree with somebody. But there's something in you that just says, fuck it. And notice how the be with what is, or the non-dual, or the meditation can enmesh with that. So it's like people are saying and doing things around you, and you're hearing the context. Just let it all be as it is. There's no boundaries, presence. Let it all be. And that mimics the repression mechanism, because the anger repressing ego can't set boundaries. So the boundarylessness is how it falls asleep in that. And even though reality is boundaryless, boundaries are needed for anger repression, because we have to speak up. We have to start being ourselves now. And sometimes that means saying no. It's not always just going along with everything. Look for that. Look for not being able to say no, set boundaries, people pleasing, being overly agreeable. Just not saying you disagree is a big thing. You can't possibly agree with everybody. So if you find yourself doing that, it's a telltale sign. Look for chronic pain. It can definitely be a sign of it. Body contraction can be a sign of it. If you tend to cry more easily or get hurt, even when a moment when anger would be appropriate, you're like really like feeling like even small or even despair or victim, powerless. That's your system. If you're an anger repressor, going to something that's safer. So look for the safe stuff. Like it's the stuff that reappears. It's not because the repression doesn't appear, it drives it. So with the repression in the body, you're not going to feel that full anger, but you might feel the woundedness or the sadness keeps coming up, or a shutdown or something, when it would have been appropriate to feel or express or at least process anger. Just look for safer emotions. And by the way, anger repressors often want to think that they are sadness repressors. If they have a repression that it's like hurt or sadness, why? Because we're scared of anger. We just don't want it to be true. We don't want to see that we're raging homicidal maniacs under the peaceful facade or whatever. Understandably so. But doesn't matter, because that's what's going on. Whether we want to see it or not, right? I understand not wanting to see it, but if this is the driver for a lot of suffering, we have to get over that. And we have to get really earnest about what our primary repression really is. So again, the reason I know all this is because I did it. Like through the years, if you would have asked me, what is your primary repression? First of all, I would have said, go away, because I don't talk about repression. Everything is just arising to awareness, like repression. Well, it was repressed, so I couldn't talk about it. But I was also denying it. Terms like shadows and repression and trauma, well, we might deny it when we get to spirituality, because that's stuff I don't want to feel, right? Watch yourself dismissing or denying things with spiritual words. Just watch for it, because that's another sign of it. Yeah. Look for all those things. For chronic pain, look for where hurt or sadness shows up more. Look for how you just don't get angry very much, or if you do, you don't really express it. Look for quiet bully or quiet punishing. This is where the anger repression enmeshes again with the presence work or practice, because it's just not good, because we get really unconscious right here. In a conflict for anger repressors, sometimes we'll just shut down and go quiet. And that mimics the quietness that we're pointed to in awareness, but this is a shutdown state. So unconsciously with anger repressors, remember, we're anger repressors. We are angry. Anger repressors are angry. They have stored anger. So the quiet bullying is an unconscious mechanism that you can make conscious, but basically it's like sitting over here going, I'm not going to talk to her. I'll show her. And it's like you're bullying, but unconsciously, I did it. Or you're just shut down. And so in the face of conflict, when it might be healthier to feel and express something, you go quiet. And so that you don't give your partner or that other person yourself, right? And that itself can be triggering. You're not expressing your feelings and how you really think about something. That's not something that we like in relationship. We may not know that we don't like that, but it leaves us feeling like, where's the connection here? Another thing for anger repressors is you might think that if I gave you that inquiry, I can be vulnerable. You might think, because I used to think, I'm sorry, let me strike that back. Let me go back to hurt and sadness. I want to tell on myself here, and I forgot. Through the years, I did exactly that. I wanted to believe that my issue was victimhood, unlovable self, woundedness, sadness, growing up gay, being the victim, all this. That was not my repression. In fact, in some ways, I was kind of wearing that on my sleeve. I even came out with a modality about it, like, hey, deficiency story, I'm unlovable. See, not repressing that. So through the years, I kept processing that, as I've said, and that was my bypass right there. So I know what it's like to go to hurt or sadness because it's safe. Stay away from anger. Are you doing that? Listen for the resume. Listen for the mind that says, I've already done anger work, because that's just you trying to stay safe. Because all that matters in any moment is, are you repressing or identified with something? It's not how much work have you done. That's for the ego, how much work that you've done. We are alive. We are awake. We are sentient. We are here, right here. This is it. This is an alive thing. This isn't, I did work. Like I bought insurance so that I don't have to really be here. No, here, vulnerable, open. Not, I've done work. That doesn't help us. Be earnest. Watch for the resume. That's the resume landing point there. Because that's just, again, we're protecting ourselves. It doesn't matter whether you opened to anger 2 years ago. If you're repressing it now, that's all that matters. Look for how you define vulnerability. That's where I was going to go. And this is, again, something that I did. Through the years, I just thought vulnerability meant opening to the more vulnerable emotions, which was really convenient for my trauma, because the vulnerable emotions were sadness and hurt. And that was just safer for me. So that wasn't really me being vulnerable. That was me avoiding anger. And sadness or anger repressors will often do that. They'll say, well, they'll even have their partners be more vulnerable with me. But what they're saying is, your anger is a trigger. I'm an anger repressor. Go to sadness or hurt. That's safer for me. But that's all unconscious. So redefine the word vulnerability for you, for us here. Vulnerability is being emotionally honest with regard to the full spectrum of traits and emotions that are here for us. Being ourselves fully, which means if I repress anger, I'm going to discover vulnerability by going to the repression of anger. I'm not going to find true vulnerability by going to a safer emotion, because vulnerability isn't safe. We have to open ourselves up. Be vulnerable. Get hurt. We can't do that when we're self-protecting, even around anger. What happens is, here's what we've learned in KI. When we repress anger, when I came out of anger repression, I noticed and I developed what's called the vulnerability inquiry, which is where you say, I'm not angry. But the full vulnerability inquiry is to go through each of the rungs of emotion. So you start with, I'm not angry, and watch and allow all that. You go to, I'm not afraid, and then I'm not hurt. You move through those rungs. You really sit with everything. Well, the reason that that was created was because out of necessity. Everything is created out of necessity here because it's meeting our experience. But basically, when I was coming out of anger repression, finally allowing anger fully, I noticed that layered in that anger was fear and hurt that I couldn't access because it was layered in with the anger, that particular conditioning around that. So a wake-up call around vulnerability is that sometimes we have to open to vulnerability, open to anger repression, to really be able to open up to sadness and fear fully, because we're so protecting around anger. We're afraid, and that fear is running things. We have to open to that fear and that anger so that the full spectrum of emotions are online for us. We don't have to, but I guarantee that we want that. That's why we're here, right? Okay. I've given you a lot, guys. This is exciting. I hope you've written down the inquiries. I hope you understand the reason that I gave you those inquiries. I hope you understand the things that I'm asking you to look at and what the inside out path looks like. Body first, along with the awareness recognition. Whereas the outside in is often very focused on the attainment of the awareness recognition. And by the way, it's often run by men. And there's something about that, I think. When I've met certain women or trained certain women, sometimes they are much more tuned into the energetic quality of realization. And I think that's where we have to go in embodiment, because the emotional body, the energy of that we have to open to that. So when we focus in the outside in path around attainment of the recognition, that can often be men playing it safe and repressing emotion like they normally do. Be careful with it, because this isn't about attainment at all. And so we're focusing on that. Here's another thing. I mean, attainment, there's nobody here to attain. So if we're really focused on that, I question that. Or even after we've attained the awareness recognition, if we're still just focused on that, I question that, because that's very convenient. We don't have to go into the unconscious that way. We just continue focusing on I'm awareness. That's a big part of the problem right there, because this is energetic too. This is just all my experience, obviously. You're free to disagree. Just want to cover everything so that you can always come back to this video, Anger Repressors, and get everything that you need in terms of context and at least starter inquiries. And it makes me happy to do that for you all, because I know the richness of this work. And to think that there are people out there right now repressing anger who are going to discover this richness, and you're going to feel some uncomfortable stuff on the way, I'll tell you, but that's part of it. Okay, let me just check to see. I've given you the inquiries, given you the main part of the context, different points. This is really important, actually. Remember that the outside in path, this is really important for anger repressors, I think, to sort of understand why we're doing inside out, is because remember, we had unconscious parents, so we couldn't feel and express, be ourselves. So we still can't when we're adults and we get to these teachings. So it's like we're snuggling up to a parent figure, which we often have to, a teacher or a coach or a therapist or trainer, because we still don't know ourselves. And we are not yet the authority for our own experience, because we were raised and conditioned not to be trusting our experience. So the outside in path is a continuation of that trauma in the beginning, where we're looking for somebody else to tell it's okay to be ourselves, to be what we are. So that's fine. We even do that in the inside out path. We want to have somebody who's done the work that can help us through some of those areas. But this thing has to go, because with the inside out path, it's all about trusting your body and your own experience, being and seeing what you couldn't be and see when you were a child, which is that you're the authority for your own experience. Your thoughts and feelings are completely valid. They're all allowed. There's nothing wrong with them. You're actually beautiful and perfect exactly the way you are. You just think that you're not. Because it's conditioning. See, it's not real. It's what you believe in order to stay safe and get love. It's not objective reality. Remember, even if it seems real and true. People usually like the silence. Or you guys tell me that. That's just me like going blank there. Just making sure I cover everything. Um, yeah, trusting your own experience. See, that's part of the trauma bond, isn't it? Like it's so innocent. It's not judgment. Just see it. Don't make it a bad thing. Just see it. Don't be blind to it. Meaning that you had parents that were unconscious. You couldn't be yourself. You still can't. You're looking to somebody else. The whole point of that relationship ought to be freeing you to trust and be the authority for your own experience. But how can we do that in the outside impact if we're not going into the emotions that we've buried since childhood, which are why we can't be ourselves? See, that shouldn't be dealt with at the end of the path, because there's this thing that gets set up where it's hard to let go of the authority or the teacher or whatever, because we still can't trust ourselves. So from the beginning, we want to trust our bodies, trust ourselves, our own experience, and increase our skill level to meet that experience. So inevitably, because we're traumatized and repressed, people come to KI and they ask me, Scott, what do I do? I totally understand that. That's why I'm doing these videos. I'm telling you, do this, do that. But the whole point of that, I want you to hear this part, is you're opening to that which you could never open to. You're trusting your own experience. So when you're saying, I can say and do what I want, you're bringing up the conditioning that doesn't allow you to trust your own experience. So you are actually doing the work that you couldn't do when you were a child. So you're going to be letting go of me and everybody else and trusting your experience, hopefully earlier on this path than the other path. And it's all about that here. You're going to need us for a while and we're going to be there. I'm going to keep showing up. But the juicy part of this is when I look at you and I realize you have a high skill level and you're taking care of business. Like you're living, enjoying your life and you're doing the work. There's nothing that I can do when you're in that place. There's nothing or anybody else can do when you have that high skill level that can do better for yourself than you can, better for you than you can. Now, every now and then, we're always going to want to reach out to somebody and like sit with somebody or be facilitated when we're blocked or something. But this work empowers you to trust yourself and gain skill and really, really meet your experience. Not just that you're the perceiving awareness, but everything that that awareness can't see. It's creating suffering here in the form of anger repression. Okay, sorry, I'm just piling everything in here just so you can come back. You could come back later and just write notes if you want. I'm not slowing down. As you can see, I'm just getting it all out there for you. The more of this information you hear, the better, because it'll shape your practice. This information changes us, you know, and it changes us and hopefully helps us open to experience, to practice. That's why it's important to say it all. Okay, let's see what's left here. I've covered a lot. Oh, well, people say, what do I do next? So I've given you that. But again, you're going to want to trust your own experience. Once you get to third dimension, it's all your experience. You're working with your primary repression, the trauma responses, frozen fear. Well, that's another topic. Frozen fear. For that, I have to pull the map up. Oops. Why do we call it frozen fear? Why isn't it just fear? Well, because it's frozen. Meaning It's old fear trapped in your body that doesn't feel like fear anymore. This would be your tight stomach or your chronic pain or your heart contraction or some energy that stays around. So I've been talking about repression, but if you can just understand it this way, since talking to anger repressors, is that from a very early age, you were afraid to feel and express anger. So you didn't just store anger in your body, you stored fear with it. And frankly, there's going to be some shame and hurt and other emotions in that, because emotions are not really separate. It's just energy. We put different names on the energy. So frozen fear is usually something that we don't really discover, at least in KI, until we get to third dimension, because it's really frozen in the body. And again, it would just be it'd be like a deep tightness somewhere or a pain. And it's going to be right there with the anger repression conditioning. But frozen fear is a huge topic in KI, because as you can see, the fear, the red lines there, that represents fear, that's running throughout our whole experience. And it's the fear of expressing ourselves, the fear of being ourselves. And then there's fear when we identify with the separate self, we're afraid, we're trying to survive. So fear is running everything, but a lot of it is frozen in the body. And of course, like anything with trauma, it's producing effects: fight, flight, freeze, can't express myself, can't do this, can't do that, have to believe this, have to believe that. But again, frozen fears with repression is creating that, but we don't get to it on the outside empath, if at all, till the end. How do I know that? For example, when Ajay talks about shame, he's really talking in part about the fear of being seen, the fear of expressing yourself, shame. So even he is inadvertently telling us that fear we often get to, the really deep fear. I am not talking about the fear of death that we often deal with in the awakening. I'm talking about the fear of being yourself, which is sometimes more terrifying than death to the body. The fear of actually just being yourself and loving openly, because that's where this work goes, is just openness. And that's scary for a system that's traumatized. But it's totally what we need to experience that deeper freedom and healing and love. And I still have to bring something up here. Anger repression drives addiction. So many of you in the outside empath, you have not known maybe why your addiction continues, even though you're doing these practices or recognizing presence. That's because the repression is, again, unconscious. So the perceiving awareness can't see that driver. What you see is, I'm going to drink another beer. That's what you see. What you feel is, I have to eat brownies right now. You don't see that you're doing that because you're afraid to be yourself and you're holding anger back. And on the outside empath, again, addiction is another thing. It's like shocking, because we're with the outside in, we're not dealing with the body from the beginning, which where the repression is. So people were surprised through the years to discover that they would just remain addicted. But it doesn't surprise me now, because we're not getting to the root driver. So when you get into KI and natural recovery, you have to remember that if you're really going to let go of addiction or compulsion through this work, you have to do the work. You can, of course, put something down by force. Like, I forcibly am sober off of heroin. I don't want to do heroin, and I won't. I don't have any other rules, though. I don't forcibly keep myself from using something, because this is just my path. I'm not encouraging you in any way, but because my way is to process the trauma and repression driving addiction. It's not to try to stop doing things. You don't have to do it that way, but you have to remember, though, first of all, the outside empath, where they're not getting to the body first, you should expect addiction to continue. On the inside out path, where we're going to the body first, you should expect addictions to continue However, now you're processing the driver. So you should expect that to fall away if you're skillful and you live that inquiry. But that's something we'll talk about, because again, we don't want to feel anger. So it's just so much easier for the system to just go have a glass of wine. And by the way, there's frozen fear with that. So it's medicating a number of things for us, self-soothing, if you will. Now, I'm going to leave you with just a few things that I'm going to suggest that you not do if you're an anger repressor. Number one, do not just have a practice of meditation or resting as awareness. If you are with just first dimension teachings and practices, correct that right away, because that is how the repression stays, in my view. So I would just definitely change that. Keep the practice, but don't just limit it to that. Like, of course, you are awareness, like recognize that. But if that's your only practice, I would just change it. Don't get talked into not doing trauma, repression, and shadow work. Some of the teachers of outside in have a vested interest in you not being interested in this topic because they don't share about it. So they might downplay it or dismiss it. That's not a good thing. We have science now that tells us it's a driver behind suffering. That teacher might just not know, or might have some sort of agenda that you're not even aware of. Look for people who are aware of this, these teachers. And if they're not, don't let them talk you out of meeting your suffering, because we often look up to them. So if they say something, if they're misleading us and we don't check into it for ourselves, inside out is always about verifying for ourselves what's producing suffering. If we verify for ourselves that trauma and repression is driving everything, and a teacher says that's not going on, we know better. So until you know better, until you discover this, I'm asking you to just don't listen to it. Because in 2023, it doesn't gel to say ignore trauma. In any circle that I know, mental health, addiction treatment field, most forms of good spirituality. Again, that's just my perspective. I'm trying to help. And here's the last one. You don't have to do this one, but don't just sit there with a teacher or someone and not ask questions, because you can learn a lot by asking questions. Ask your teacher what their relationship is to anger or sadness. Ask them if they know what they primarily repress. Ask them if they've done any trauma work and how they did that, because we know that it's unconscious. So they're going to have to explain that in some way. And then if you find out that you're with a teacher who doesn't really know about that, I would say don't stay there. Find a different teaching and then bring KI in. If you've got a teacher who's doing that, where that's happening, I would definitely. These are the traps for anger repressors. All these things are like getting stuck somewhere in a certain practice or a certain belief. Oh, and for everybody, I'm about to go here. As part of your contacts, remember, everything doesn't arise to awareness. Drop that context. If any teacher says it, again, trust your experience. Come into KI. We're going to show you the stuff that doesn't arise. But until you see it yourself, pick up the context. When someone says that, I don't think everything arises to awareness. Because if you don't, you might believe it. And it's so easy for us to fall asleep in these paradigms that are not true and protect ourselves from anger. Stand your ground when you hear these things. Stay on course. Don't fall prey to, because with anger repressors, we can do that. We can be agreeable. See, so if we don't stand our ground, if we don't say, no, I know that I have anger repression, I've tested this out with KI, and somebody says, no, that's not what's going on. But because we haven't reversed the anger repression, we can't speak up and say, no, that's what's going on. Stop saying that. I know my experience, you're gaslighting me. Until we come out of repression, sometimes we can't. And so we become agreeable and we mold our paradigm to meet somebody else's that doesn't really match our experience. So I'm actually asking you not to pick up my framework. Well, I am in the beginning, but what I'm asking you to do is to do the work. Because when you do the work, the framework, I think, will make perfect sense as your own experience at that point. You won't be just parroting what I say. Thank you all. I hope this helped. It's been fun for me.